What family secret was finally spilled in your family? Story 1. That my parents had to get married. They always told us they got married in 1961, but it was 1962, 3 months before my sister was born. What's amusing is that my father was an accountant who was insanely fast with math. Whenever he was asked how many years they'd been married, he'd be off by 1. My mother would correct him through clenched teeth, and then my father would nod and agree. I was always told by an older relative of mine that the first child in a marriage, for some reason, always took less than 9 months. I always found it amusing to think about that. Story 2. When my paternal grandfather died, the federal gov reached out to do a state funeral. He'd been a career Army and a colonel, so we didn't question it. Then the funeral came and they went all out. Huge procession, people showing up who are really big names like heads of DEPs, senators, retired senators, people from the CIA and state DEPT. It was nuts and we were all super confused. Turns out he was a key dude in the OSI during World War II, and when the OSI splintered into the CIA and Secret Service, he went the Secret Service route. He wasn't on White House detail, but instead worked in a covert office that dealt with counterfeiting and currency. He went blind when I was a toddler and retired from the Army. For whatever reason, he told no one about all his covert work with the OSI and Secret Service, and the only person who knew, my grandmother, was sworn to secrecy and never told anyone. My father grew up thinking he was just a colonel working on base. Only after his death were we given all sorts of cool shit like publications by him, lectures given by him, and all kinds of things from various things he did and was known for. All I knew him as was a blind old man who was perpetually smoking, drinking, and being a crotchety bastard. Turns out he was a bad motherfucker, and all but none of us knew. Story 3. My great-grandmother wasn't actually Mexican, but rather was adopted by a Mexican family from a Chinese family who was being kicked out of Mexico when railroad construction was over. She always had more typically Asian features, but only spoke Spanish, and it was never really questioned. 23andMe is a hell of a thing. Story 4. My mother is 7 or 10. My aunt, kid 4, who was born in 1945, did her DNA, and found out that she has a different father from everyone else. She was devastated. There was always rumor that there was an affair, but nobody talked about it. She has so many questions, but nobody's alive to answer her. Story 5. This is kind of messed up, but my parents told me my mom had a bad back because I pushed on her spine during birth. This was what I thought all my childhood. I think I was in my teens when my older brother told me my dad pushed my mom during an argument, and she fell and had to have surgery. I thought I ruined my mom's back my entire childhood, and those SOBs let me believe it. Story 6. When I was 5 years old, 1988, Santa Claus left a Nintendo on our front porch. It was wrapped in newspaper, and my parents had no idea who had given it to us. My dad, particularly, tried to figure it out. He was always suspicious that it had been a family friend. It was by far the best gift of the year, and we played it all the time throughout our childhood. My dad died in 2004. Last Christmas, my mom explained that she was the one who had bought it and surreptitiously placed it on the porch. My dad really liked to be in control of things and had forbidden the purchase. She knew better. She didn't tell a soul for 30 years. Thanks, Mom. Story 7. I see a lot of stories about people finding out that who they thought was their parents weren't the people raising them, and this one is a little bit different. My dad always thought his father who raised him wasn't his bio dad, and the father thought the same. He was treated terribly by his father because the father was told he couldn't have children, and my father was born prematurely, but at a healthy weight. So everyone assumed my grandmother had an affair and got pregnant with my dad. It was to the point that after my grandmother died, my grandfather failed to even mention to his new wife that he had a son and grandchild, me. Years later, my dad gets an ancestry DNA test for him and me. He finds out that his dad was actually his bio dad. It was shocking and sad. When she was growing up, my grandmother was told by her older siblings that she had a different father than them. They believed their mother was having an affair with a neighbor, and that was my grandmother's biological father. My mom and I both took DNA tests, and it matched us both with cousins from my grandmother's older siblings and with relatives from their bio dad's family. Great-grandma may have indeed been having an affair, but that didn't mean my grandmother was a product of that affair. Sadly, even after explaining all of this to her, my grandmother still refuses to believe that her parents were the same as her older siblings. Story 8. My de facto uncle. He and my aunt never married but have been together since well before I was born, with a few hiccups. Has a child with another woman. It became common knowledge when the girl was 6 and was starting to understand the situation. At first it was a bit scandalous, but she's been welcomed with open arms by my entire family, including her half-siblings' maternal grandparents. She's treated the same as all the other kids her age. Her half-sister, my cousin, has a daughter the same age, and they're best friends, go to the same high school, totally inseparable, technically aunt and niece, haha. She comes to all our family events, and she's an awesome kid. We're all stoked to have her in our family. Story 9. After my mom died, I found out the real story behind my parents' marriage. She came to my father's country to visit some of her relatives, met my father, and after just 1 week, she asked him to marry her so she could stay in the country. My father accepted because he had no one else, and his parents were pressing him to get married already. But the highlight of the story is that over some time, the two of them fell in love with each other. Their love only grew over time, and they were really happy together. My mother spent her last days very ill, and she would accept only my father by her bedside. He swears to this day that she was an angel sent from God to take care of him. I am shocked that they got married just like that, out of the blue, and ended up loving each other so deeply. I can only hope to have as good and loving marriage as they had. Story 10. About a month ago, my mother-in-law's 88-year-old sister revealed on her deathbed that her husband's best friend was actually the father of all 4 of her children. Her husband was an abusive grade A jerk by all accounts. While everyone was shocked, no one was saddened by this news. Story 11. My uncle served in Vietnam. While over there, his troop found a baby that had been orphaned or abandoned. They aren't sure. My uncle was shipping back to Australia soon and wanted to adopt him, but my aunt said no. They'd only been married about 4 months when he was drafted, so while I don't agree with my aunt's actions and generally don't like her as a person, I can understand why she said no. My uncle's troop found a family to raise the baby, and that's the story the whole family knows. The secret is that my uncle and some other guys from his troop stayed in contact with the family and the kid, sending them money every month to help raise him, and then to help him go to university, and eventually helped him and his adoptive family move to Australia in the late 90s. My aunt and the rest of my family had no idea all this time. It only came out when my aunt and uncle divorced in 2017, and she had a forensic accountant go through their bank records. She worked at a bank for like 40 years and always noticed the money missing, but his reasons were always justified. Since we all know now, my uncle has introduced some of us to the guy and his family. They're all really lovely people. I was half asleep when I posted this and realized I left out a pretty important detail to explain why I don't like my aunt for this facepalm to preface. I'm child-free, and if my husband was in this situation, I'd say no as well. It's not the fact she said no to adopting the kid that makes me dislike her for this. It's her reason. Aunt is very against Asian people. Doesn't matter what part of Asia, she hates them. She's the kind of person who will yell, "Go back to your own country," at random strangers who even vaguely look like they may have Asian ancestry. She also cut contact with my cousin, her daughter. Because my cousin's husband is half Japanese, she said in front of my family with no shame that if the kid hadn't been Asian, she would have said yes to adopting him. Story 12. My great-grandfather didn't die of cancer. He died from complications after being shot when one of his businesses was being robbed. Maybe. He also spent a lot of time in Atlantic City. He also had a lot of partners in the Teamsters and other unions in coal country. Also, everyone called him Smiling Tony, but his name wasn't Tony. He died in the 60s, long before my time, but when my great-grandmother died 20 years ago, a very old guy showed up to the funeral in a white suit, and all of the oldest people in my family kissed his hand. When I asked, no one knew who he was. My grandfather moved his family away from Central PA in the late 60s and disconnected from all of this, but there it is. Story 13. My grandmother recently died. She was famous in our town for her amazing cooking and catering, in particular her turkey dinners. Notably, her gravy was absolutely amazing. It was so delicious. She had a heart attack several years ago, and her near-death experience convinced her to share some of her secret recipes with me, all except for her gravy recipe. When she died this spring, I was going through her pantry and found an entire bucket of KFC gravy mix. She was literally using KFC gravy mix as a base to make her incredible gravy. Huge scandal. Ha 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 ha. Story 14. My great-great-grandfather was exiled and banned from Missouri for being a sheep thief. Story 15. We went to my grandmother's for Christmas dinner like we did every year, and my uncle drank too much and kind of hinted that he had an affair with my mother. A couple of months and 2 DNA tests later, we found out my sister is actually his daughter. My dad never spoke to his brother again, and of course, my parents got divorced. And I needed a lot of therapy. And chocolate. Gosh, we are trash. Story 16. Great-grandparents' 60th anniversary party at hotel ballroom with cousins/2 distant cousins who hadn't seen each other in years. My mom and I were talking to my grandfather. Mom, wow, I haven't seen Chuck, Fred, and Claire in years. Me, no kidding. When do you think we'll get a group this big back together? Mom, Gramps' birthday is in 6 months. We'll see some people then. Me, 6 months? Isn't it his 60th? All shocked Gramps. Huh, I never thought about that. My grandfather was 60 when he realized his parents had a shotgun wedding. Story 17. I was 35 when my mother finally admitted to me that she'd been lying about who my birth father was. She waited until after I'd reached out to his other children, and we all thought we were siblings. He later confirmed I wasn't his. She refused to tell me who my biological father really was. Story 18. My mom and older brother are not biologically related to me. My bio mom died sometime after I was born, leaving me, my sister, and my dad behind. My brother was the one that told me. My parents never told me because they wanted to protect me from the truth. But my brother thought that was a BSS reason for me to not know. I don't know if my parents know that I know the truth, but I don't want to bring it up either. To address some questions, my mom immigrated here along with my older brother when he was a kid. My dad also immigrated here, and my sister and I were born after he came. I don't know much about our family history beyond that. My brother revealed this info around when I was 18. He isn't the type to lie about something like this. He also said my sister is apparently aware of the truth because she has a memory of my bio mom being in physical contact with her. I don't think too differently about my family because of this. My mom is still my mom. Story 19. I met my wife when my daughter was 16 months old. Bio dad was never in the picture. Once it was looking like a relationship that would last. We got married and briefly toyed with the idea of just never telling her. She was around 3, 4 at this time. Ultimately, we decided that it would be better to not hide it, though that has created some issues with her now half-siblings and some self-esteem issues. I just felt that her potentially finding this out as an adult might be pretty traumatizing and fucked up. It's a pretty big lie of omission, and I just wasn't comfortable with it. Also as important, I believe, for medical history-related things she'll encounter later in life. Lastly, it gives Bio Dad the chance to do an about-face, perhaps as unlikely as that may be, and get to know his daughter without the massive trauma of an unspoken lie being brought into play. To ease into it, at around 4 years old, I started saying things to her like, "After I met you and Mommy," and "This insert situation happened before I met you and Mommy." She was able to put 2 and 2 together as time progressed, so it wouldn't have to be a sit-down confession, but rather a more evolutionary realization which we guided her through. Story 20. My grandma didn't drive. I thought she couldn't, but it was just never discussed. One day when I was maybe 7, 8, I'd been trying to get anyone to drive me to the store for candy. We were visiting my aunt and uncle. Grandma lived with them. They had bit of honey at the local store, which I could no longer get at home, but no one would take me to the store. Finally, I said I'd just ask Grandma, and my cousin chimes in with, "Grandma can't drive." "Oh, you bet I can drive, they just don't let me." Grandma had overheard and she was in high dudgeon. But that's all that was said about it, and my aunt finally took me to the store, so I forgot about it. Years later, when I'd just gotten my license, I asked my mom what was up with Grandma not driving. She explained that during Prohibition, Grandma bootlegged alcohol for moonshiners. She was very successful at it. She was so successful at it that when the moonshiners were finally busted, even though the revenuers never caught my grandma, her license was suspended by the state to never be reissued. Later in life, she was told she could petition for it back, but it came with an admission of guilt or some such. She told him to go to hell. Story 21. Dad got a girl pregnant and she decided to go it alone. She moved across the state and had my half-sister. She met a guy, married, and he raised her like she was his own. They had no other children. She didn't reveal my dad's identity until after he died. Apparently, she contacted my grandma and mom, but they kept it from us. Years later, half-sister has a kid with medical issues and needs to know family medical history. She contacts mom and grandma, who again don't tell us. Meanwhile, after dad died, my uncle had prints made of a favorite picture of dad. He gets them framed and gives them to all us kids, as well as my grandma, aunts, and uncles. Mom gets a picture of our half-sister after their secret meeting. Fast forward another few years. My brother and his roommate live in a nearby large city and hit a bar and pick up and bring home some ladies to sleep over. The next morning, my half-sister sees a photo of my dad on the mantle, turns white, and asks, "Whose picture is that?" "That's my roommate's dad. He died a long time ago." "I need to talk to your roommate." She lived her entire life across the state, hundreds of miles. Her friend was going to school in a large city near our hometown. She was visiting, and they decided to go to a bar. They get picked up by my brother and his roommate. That's how we found out. My brother went to my grandma and asked about her, and grandma first denied it, then gave in and spilled the beans. Small world. Story 22. After my grandfather passed, we found out he had fathered a child when he was posted in Italy during World War II. He never knew. His mother intercepted any letters from the Italian girl. He came home, met and married my grandmother, and had 4 children. I forget who in the family found out and how. It's crazy to think we have a whole Italian family out there. My oldest aunt is 77, so this kid would be at least 79 by now, I would think. We've considered doing the DNA testing, but some family members aren't comfortable with how those companies could use the information. It's a really sad story, but if his mother hadn't intercepted the letters, I wouldn't exist. It's a weird place to be in emotionally.